In this episode, we're going to do spaced retrieval again, but this time the goal is bigger than naming a single attack type. You are going to practice recognizing which playbook you should reach for when you hear a short incident story, and that means you must quickly decide whether the situation smells like cloud abuse, supply chain compromise, or ransomware. Beginners often know the definitions of these topics separately, but the real challenge is switching gears when the evidence is incomplete and the first report is messy. Spaced retrieval helps because it strengthens the mental pathways you need under pressure, so you do not have to think from scratch every time. As you listen, try to make a quick decision in your head about which playbook applies, and then notice the clue that led you there. The clue is more important than the label, because the clue is what you will recognize in the future when everything is noisy. By the end, you should feel more confident moving from a symptom to the right response mindset. Let's start with a scenario that tests whether you can recognize cloud exposure versus cloud identity compromise. A team discovers that a storage location in the cloud was accessible to anyone with the link, and a search shows many downloads from unfamiliar network locations over the past 2 weeks. There are no obvious strange administrative logins, but some internal employees say they did not realize the storage was shared publicly. If you chose the cloud playbook, that is correct, and the key clue is exposure through configuration rather than a stolen identity. The right response mindset is contain exposure first by restricting access, then assess what data was accessible, and then consider whether any secrets were stored there that require rotation. You also note the shared responsibility clue, which is that the provider did not leak your data, your configuration made it reachable. This is not about proving malicious intent first. It is about removing public access immediately and then scoping impact. The fast recognition cue is public reachability combined with evidence of access, even without account takeover signs. Now a scenario that shifts the cloud lens toward identity and control plane risk. An audit log shows a successful administrative login to a cloud console from a new device, followed by the creation of new access keys and a change to a policy that grants broad permissions to a role used by automation. Soon after, there is unusual resource creation that drives up usage and cost. If you mentally chose the cloud playbook again, you are right, but notice the different clue that changes the first actions. This smells like identity-led cloud compromise and service abuse, because the story includes administrative actions, new keys, permission widening, and resource provisioning. The immediate mindset is revoke sessions and keys, contain the ability to create resources, rotate exposed secrets, and verify what was created and what data might have been accessed. The cue is control plane behavior that expands privileges and creates new trust objects. Even without naming the exact services, you can recognize the pattern and reach for the right response steps. Now let's pivot to supply chain recognition, where the clue is often that many organizations see similar symptoms at roughly the same time. Several companies in the same industry report suspicious behavior shortly after installing an update from a widely used vendor product. Internal monitoring shows the new version introduced a network connection pattern that did not exist before, and teams cannot explain why it needs that connection. If you chose the supply chain playbook, that is the right move, because the key clue is a legitimate update acting as a distribution mechanism. The mindset becomes scope blast radius by inventorying where the product and version exist, coordinate with the vendor and internal owners, and remediate by rolling back or patching to a known good version while verifying integrity. You also treat trust as the central issue, because the update channel is normally trusted. The queue is a change introduced through normal vendor processes that appears across multiple customers. In a supply chain playbook, coordination and version scoping become urgent, not optional. Here is another supply chain scenario, but this time the clue is not a vendor update, but a component that many teams reuse. A development team notices that a commonly used library released a minor update, and soon after, build systems begin making outbound connections during compilation in a way they never did before. Multiple teams who use the same library report similar behavior, even though their applications are different. If you chose supply chain again, you are correct, and the key clue is dependency poisoning or compromised component distribution. The response mindset is to identify where the dependency exists, freeze or control ingestion of the affected version, rebuild from trusted sources, and coordinate internally so teams do not reintroduce the poison component. The blast radius question is not which servers were attacked first, but which products and pipelines pulled the compromised dependency. The queue is abnormal behavior introduced through a dependency that is shared across products. This is why inventory of dependencies and build inputs matters, because the incident lives in the software supply chain. Now let's switch to ransomware recognition, where the clue is operational disruption and extortion pressure. Users report that files on shared drives are suddenly unreadable, many file names have changed, and systems display a ransom note demanding payment within a short deadline. At the same time, some core systems begin failing because shared storage is unavailable. If you chose the ransomware playbook, that is correct, and the queue is encryption behavior plus extortion messaging and immediate business impact. The immediate mindset is containment to stop spread, protection of backups and identity systems, and rapid scoping to determine what is encrypted and what is still at risk. You also assume there may have been privilege gained and data theft earlier, because encryption is often the visible end of a longer intrusion. The queue is rapid loss of data usability combined with an explicit demand, which makes this a crisis event rather than a quiet compromise. This scenario demands speed, but speed with structure, because random actions can worsen damage. Here is a ransomware scenario that tests whether you can recognize the business stopper impact, even if the number of encrypted machines seems small. Only a handful of servers appear encrypted, but those servers include the identity service used for authentication and a database that supports a critical business application. Employees cannot log into many tools, and customer-facing services begin timing out. If you chose ransomware playbook again, you are right, and the key clue is dependency impact rather than raw count of encrypted devices. Beginners sometimes count affected systems and underestimate severity, but ransomware impact is about what was hit, not how many were hit. The response mindset prioritizes restoring foundational dependencies and containing spread so the disruption does not widen. The queue is loss of central services that many other systems depend on, especially identity and core data stores. When you hear this, you should think business stopper immediately, even if the device count is low. Now let's practice switching playbooks when the first clue points one way, but later clues reveal a different route. A company experiences a sudden cost spike in cloud usage and sees new compute resources created overnight. At first, it looks like cloud service abuse, but then the team discovers that the access key used belongs to a third-party integration provided by a vendor, and the vendor later reports they had a breach affecting customer keys. If you initially thought cloud and then shifted to supply chain, that is exactly the move you want to be able to make quickly. The incident is playing out in the cloud, but the upstream cause is a supply chain trust breach through a vendor relationship. The response still uses the cloud playbook actions, like revoking keys and containing resources, but the coordination and scoping mindset becomes supply chain, because other customers and other integrations may be at risk. The cue is that the compromised identity is tied to an external trust path, not a normal internal user. This shows why playbooks can overlap, and why you sometimes need to run two mindsets at once. Here is another blend that tests your ability to notice a supply chain precursor to ransomware. An organization learns that a vendor's remote management product was compromised and that attackers may have used it to access customers. A week later, the organization experiences widespread encryption and extortion demands. If you recognize that the supply chain event may have provided initial access and privilege gain, and that ransomware is the later stage, you are seeing the chain correctly. The response now needs ransomware containment and recovery actions, but it also needs supply chain remediation, such as removing or isolating the compromised management pathway and resetting trust with the vendor. The queue is a known upstream breach followed by a downstream intrusion that reaches the encryption phase. This is why early supply chain scoping is so important. The downstream outcomes can be severe if attackers use the trusted path to stage ransomware. In practice, you would treat the supply chain compromise as part of root cause and persistence, not as a separate incident. Now practice one more rapid recognition pattern for cloud that often gets mistaken for ransomware because it can disrupt operations. A cloud storage service suddenly becomes inaccessible to internal applications, and teams report errors, but there is no ransom note and no evidence of encryption. Investigation shows access policies were changed and keys were rotated unexpectedly, breaking application access. If you chose Cloud Playbook, that is correct, and the clue is configuration and identity changes that cause availability impact without extortion. Attackers might be involved, but the first response is to verify what changed, restore intended access, and determine whether those changes were malicious or accidental. The absence of extortion messaging and the presence of administrative policy change clues point away from ransomware and toward cloud control plane activity. This is a good reminder that not all outages are ransomware, even if they are disruptive. Your recognition skill is to separate business impact from attacker leverage, and ransomware leverage almost always includes an extortion component. As we wrap up, notice what spaced retrieval is doing for you here. You are not just memorizing that cloud equals misconfiguration, supply chain equals vendor, and ransomware equals encryption. You are learning to hear a short story and identify the clue that points to the right response mindset. Public exposure and control plane actions for cloud, upstream trust distribution and shared components for supply chain, and encryption plus extortion pressure for ransomware. You are also practicing the reality that incidents can blend, where a supply chain breach leads to cloud compromise, or where an upstream compromise becomes a ransomware event later. The more you practice switching playbooks based on the earliest reliable clue, the faster you become at making good first decisions under pressure. That is the practical purpose of this review. Build rapid recognition that leads to calm, structured action instead of delayed confusion.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.